My husband left me waiting for 5 hours at a fancy restaurant on our anniversary. When he finally showed up with his friends, he laughed. Did you think she'd still be here, waiting like a faithful dog? They all laughed. I smiled, ordered another drink, then stepped out. His face changed when he realized I'd booked a first-class flight to Rome with his credit card. I, 34F, never thought my marriage would end over a dinner reservation, but here we are. Our 5th anniversary was supposed to be special. Mark had insisted on Le Bernardin, the restaurant where he'd proposed 3 years earlier. He'd made the reservation himself, told me to dress up, and even suggested I take the afternoon off work to get ready. I should have known something was wrong when he seemed more excited about the restaurant than spending time with me. I arrived at 7 sharp, wearing the black dress he'd bought me for my birthday. The hostess seated me at our usual corner table, the one with the view of the city lights. I ordered a glass of wine and waited. 7:30 came and went. Then 8. My phone showed no missed calls, no texts explaining the delay. The waitstaff began giving me pitying looks. Other couples were seated, served, and finished their meals while I sat there, checking my phone every few minutes. The wine turned bitter in my mouth, but I kept sipping it because it gave me something to do with my hands. By 9:30, I'd called Mark 6 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. I started imagining car accidents, emergency surgeries, anything that would explain why my husband had abandoned me on our anniversary. The rational part of my brain whispered that he was probably just running late from work, caught up in some important meeting. But my gut knew better. At 10, I heard his laugh before I saw him. That booming, confident laugh that had first attracted me to him at a college party 15 years ago. I turned toward the entrance and watched him walk in with 3 of his work buddies, Dave, Tom, and the new guy whose name I could never remember. They were all slightly drunk, ties loosened, looking like they'd been having the time of their lives. Mark spotted me immediately. Instead of rushing over with apologies, he nudged Dave and pointed in my direction. I watched his mouth move, saw him gesture toward me, and then all 4 men burst into laughter. The sound cut through the restaurant's gentle ambience like broken glass. He sauntered over, his friends trailing behind like a pack of hyenas. When he reached the table, he didn't sit down. Instead, he looked at his friends and spoke loud enough for nearby tables to hear. He asked them if they really thought I'd still be sitting there, waiting like a faithful dog. The comparison hit me like a physical blow, but what came next was worse. They all laughed again, harder this time. Something cold settled in my chest, replacing the hurt and confusion. I looked up at my husband, this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, and smiled. The expression felt foreign on my face, like wearing someone else's clothes, but I held it steady. I raised my hand to signal the waiter and ordered another glass of wine, my voice calm and pleasant. Mark's friends were still chuckling, making jokes about married life and ball and chains. My husband basked in their attention, clearly enjoying his role as the guy who could keep his wife in line. He finally sat down, acting like nothing unusual had happened, like making me wait for 3 hours was perfectly normal behavior. I excused myself to use the restroom, taking my purse with me. In the bathroom, I pulled out my phone and opened our banking app. We'd always shared accounts, his idea, actually. He'd said married couples shouldn't have financial secrets. I scrolled through our credit cards until I found his American Express Black Card, the one he was so proud of, the one that came with no preset spending limit. The airline app loaded quickly. Rome had always been on my bucket list, something Mark dismissed whenever I brought it up. He preferred beach vacations, places where he could drink beer and watch sports on hotel TVs. But Rome called to me, the history, the art, the food, the romance of walking through streets that had existed for millennia. First-class tickets to Rome departing tomorrow morning cost $8,000. I booked it without hesitation. Then I booked the return flight for 2 weeks later, another $8,000. The confirmation emails arrived instantly, and I forwarded them to my personal email account before deleting them from his phone, which I'd memorized the password to months ago. But I wasn't done. The hassler Roma, one of the most exclusive hotels in the city, had availability. The penthouse suite for 14 nights came to $12,000. I booked it. Then I remembered I'd need spending money, so I booked a few restaurant reservations at Michelin-starred establishments, prepaying for the tasting menus. Another $3,000 gone. My hands were shaking as I made the final purchase, a shopping credit at Via dei Condotti, Rome's luxury shopping district. $5,000 that I could use for clothes, shoes, handbags, whatever struck my fancy. The total damage was just over $36,000, charged to the credit card of a man who just compared me to a dog in front of his friends. I returned to the table, where Mark was regaling his audience with stories from work. He barely glanced at me as I sat down. The waiter brought my wine, and I sipped it slowly, watching my husband perform for his friends. He was in his element, the center of attention, completely oblivious to what I'd just done. 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Then again. And again. I watched his face change as he read the notifications from his credit card company, alerting him to unusual spending activity. The color drained from his cheeks as he scrolled through the charges. His eyes found mine across the table, and for the first time that evening, he really looked at me. I finished my wine and stood up, smoothing down my dress. I told him I was tired and would be heading home. His friends were confused by the sudden tension, looking between us like spectators at a tennis match. Mark started to say something, but I was already walking away. The next morning, I was at JFK by 6 a.m. My suitcase was packed with everything I'd need for 2 weeks in Italy, plus room for whatever I'd buy there. Mark had called 17 times overnight, each voicemail more frantic than the last. I'd listened to the first few, anger, then panic, then desperate attempts at negotiation. I deleted the rest without listening. The first-class lounge was quiet at that hour, filled with business travelers and early retirees heading to European destinations. I ordered an espresso and opened my laptop to check my work email one last time. I'd used 2 weeks of accumulated vacation time, something I'd been saving for a special occasion. This qualified. My phone rang again. Mark's name flashed on the screen, but I declined the call. Instead, I opened my text messages and typed out a single sentence, telling him that faithful dogs eventually learn new tricks. Then I turned off my phone and boarded my flight to Rome. Update 1. Rome was everything I'd dreamed it would be. The Hassler Roma treated me like royalty, probably because they assumed anyone staying in the penthouse suite for 2 weeks was someone important. My room overlooked the Spanish Steps, and I spent my first morning drinking coffee on the terrace, watching the city wake up below me. I'd turn my phone back on once I landed, just long enough to see 43 missed calls from Mark and dozens of text messages ranging from angry to pleading to threatening. I screenshotted the threatening ones, they might be useful later, then turned the phone off again. The shopping district was a revelation. I'd never spent money on myself like this before. Mark had always made me feel guilty about purchases, questioning every dress, every pair of shoes, every small luxury. But his credit card had no such reservations. I bought Italian leather boots that cost more than my monthly car payment, silk scarves that felt like water against my skin, and a handbag that would make my coworkers weep with envy. But the real transformation happened at a small salon near the Pantheon. I'd walked in on impulse, my hair still in the conservative style Mark preferred. I showed the stylist a photo of a short, edgy cut I'd been admiring for years but never had the courage to try. 3 hours later, I looked like a different person. The woman in the mirror was confident, sophisticated, dangerous. I ate at restaurants where the waiters spoke to me in rapid Italian, gesturing expressively as they described dishes I'd only read about in food magazines. I visited museums and stood in front of paintings I'd studied in college, feeling their power in person. I walked through the Colosseum and imagined the gladiators who'd fought there, thinking about battles and victories and the sweet taste of revenge. On day 5, I finally turned my phone on for more than a few minutes. The voicemails had stopped, but there were text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Mark's friends, his mother, even his boss, all asking me to call them. Apparently, Mark had told everyone I'd had some kind of breakdown and stolen his credit card. The most interesting message was from a lawyer. Mark was threatening to have me arrested for theft, claiming I'd taken his credit card without permission. I laughed out loud in the middle of the Trevi Fountain Plaza. We were married. In New York, married couples have equal access to marital assets. His credit card was as much mine as his, legally speaking. I found an internet cafe and did some research. Then I called a divorce attorney in Manhattan, one with excellent reviews and a reputation for protecting women's interests. Her consultation fee was $500 for an hour-long call, charged to Mark's credit card, naturally. The attorney was fascinated by my story. She explained that while Mark could cancel the credit card, he couldn't undo the charges I'd already made. More importantly, his behavior at the restaurant, humiliating me in public, abandoning me on our anniversary, could be considered emotional abuse in divorce proceedings. The fact that I documented his threatening text messages would only strengthen my case. She advised me to enjoy the rest of my vacation and promised to have divorce papers ready when I returned. Mark would be served at his office, in front of his colleagues, just like he'd humiliated me in front of his friends. Update 2. The second week in Rome was even better than the first. Word had somehow gotten around the hotel that I was recently separated, and the staff treated me with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. The concierge, a distinguished man named Giuseppe, took it upon himself to show me the real Rome, the hidden restaurants where locals ate, the small galleries that tourists never found, the secret gardens tucked away behind ancient walls. I started taking Italian lessons from a young woman named Francesca who taught English to Italian businessmen. She was impressed by how quickly I picked up the language, and I realized it was because I was finally doing something just for myself, something Mark had never shown any interest in. My phone had become a source of entertainment rather than stress. Mark's messages had evolved from anger to bargaining to what I could only describe as panic. He'd apparently tried to cancel the credit card, but the hotel had already processed the full payment, and the airline tickets were non-refundable. He was stuck with the bill whether he liked it or not. His friends had stopped contacting me, but his mother had ramped up her efforts. She left long voicemails about how marriage required compromise and forgiveness, how I was being dramatic and childish. I saved those too. It was interesting to see where Mark had learned his dismissive attitude toward women. The most surprising contact came from Dave's wife, Sarah. We'd never been close. Mark had always discouraged me from forming friendships with the other wives, saying they were gossipy and shallow. But Sarah's message was different. She apologized for her husband's behavior at the restaurant and told me she'd heard about what happened from Dave, who'd apparently been bragging about it at home. Sarah's message revealed something I hadn't expected. She was proud of me. She said she'd always admired my patience with Mark but was glad to see I finally had enough. She also mentioned that Dave had been making similar jokes about her lately, and watching Mark get his comeuppance had given her ideas about her own marriage. I called Sarah from a cafe overlooking the Roman Forum. We talked for 2 hours, and I learned that Mark's behavior wasn't unique among his friend group. They all seemed to view their wives as accessories, sources of domestic labor and social status rather than partners. Sarah had been documenting Dave's financial infidelity, his secret gambling habit that had cost them thousands of dollars. We made a pact. When I returned to New York, we'd support each other through whatever came next. Sarah was finally ready to confront Dave about the gambling, and I was ready to end my marriage to a man who saw me as a faithful dog rather than an equal partner. On my last night in Rome, Giuseppe arranged for a private dinner on the hotel's rooftop terrace. The chef prepared a 7-course meal paired with wines from the hotel's private collection, all charged to Mark's credit card, of course. As I sat there, looking out over the eternal city, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness. I raised my glass of Barolo to the Roman skyline and made a toast to new beginnings. Tomorrow I'd fly back to New York, but I wasn't the same woman who'd left 2 weeks ago. That woman had been willing to wait 3 hours for a man who compared her to a dog. This woman was ready to fight for the life she deserved. Update 3. The flight back to New York was bittersweet. I'd grown to love Rome, love the person I'd become there, love the freedom of making decisions based on my own desires rather than someone else's expectations. But I was also eager to get home and start the next chapter of my life. Mark was waiting at JFK when I landed, looking haggard and desperate. He'd somehow figured out my flight information, probably by calling the airline and using his credit card number. He approached me at baggage claim, trying to look contrite, but I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. He started to speak, but I held up my hand to stop him. I told him we could discuss everything through our lawyers. His face went white when I mentioned lawyers, plural. He hadn't expected me to be prepared for a legal battle. The divorce papers were served the next day, just as my attorney had promised. Mark called me immediately, screaming about how I was destroying his reputation, how his colleagues were asking questions, how his boss was concerned about his judgment. I listened to his rant with detached amusement. He was worried about his reputation? He should have thought about that before humiliating me in public. The financial discovery process was illuminating. Mark had been hiding money in accounts I didn't know about, claiming it was for investment purposes. My attorney was thrilled. Hidden assets were her specialty, and Mark's attempts at financial deception would only strengthen my position in the divorce settlement. Sarah and I met for coffee regularly, supporting each other through our respective marital crises. Dave had not taken her confrontation about his gambling well, and she was now also consulting with divorce attorneys. We'd become genuine friends, something Mark had never allowed me to have during our marriage. The most satisfying moment came 6 weeks after I returned from Rome. Mark's credit card statement arrived at our apartment. I was still living there, much to his frustration, on my attorney's advice. The total for my Roman holiday was $38,467. Mark had been making minimum payments, and the interest was already accumulating. He tried one last time to convince me to reconcile, promising to change, to treat me better, to take me on real vacations. But I'd already seen what life could be like when I made my own choices, spent my own money, followed my own dreams. I wasn't interested in going back to being his faithful dog. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I got half of everything, including half the debt from my Roman vacation, which seemed poetic somehow. Mark had to sell his precious sports car to pay his portion of the credit card bill, something that gave me more satisfaction than it probably should have. I kept the apartment. Mark couldn't afford the mortgage payments on his own after the asset split. I also kept the Italian leather boots, the silk scarves, and the confidence I'd found in Rome. Most importantly, I kept the knowledge that I was worth more than waiting 3 hours for someone who saw me as a joke to share with his friends. 6 months after the divorce was final, I booked another trip to Rome. This time, I paid with my own credit card, money I'd earned from the freelance writing career I'd started after leaving my corporate job. Giuseppe was delighted to see me again, and Francesca had become fluent enough in English that we could have entire conversations in both languages. As I sat on the same terrace where I'd toasted new beginnings a year earlier, I realized that Mark had actually done me a favor that night at Le Bernardin. His cruelty had finally shown me who he really was, and more importantly, who I could become when I stopped waiting for someone else's permission to live my life. The faithful dog had learned the most important trick of all: how to walk away.